The BBC must be mutualised to end its pro-establishment bias, warns a report. I'm going to read into this more from Byline Times, you guys. Let's go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Reganelite here with an article from Byline Times with the headline that the BBC must be mutualised to end its pro-establishment bias, warns a report. It finds that the BBC's reporting is overwhelmingly focused on the concerns of senior politicians and business people around Westminster rather than the country at large. Guys, while you're here, make sure you hit the like button and share it across social media so others can find this video. I don't think it's just the BBC. I think it's a mainstream media thing as well. The BBC is one of the most trusted broadcasters in the UK still. It is, regardless of how people think about it. People look to the BBC because of it being state, and it's been around for such a long time. And it has changed a lot. It has changed a lot. And it has, in my opinion, has turned very biased in it over the last several years in particular. I would say maybe even decades. I think some people will argue as well, depending on where you are in the UK. And the biggest problem that I have with the BBC is that its chairman and the way the chairman is elected is done by government. And that's a big problem for me. And for too long, we've had Conservative chairmen or people with links to the Conservative Party who have been chairman of the BBC, thus taking a problem with certain lines or certain opinion pieces from certain people within the BBC. We have had one-sided conversations. Well, I mean, the way the BBC and other mainstream media conduct themselves on the issue around Brexit was very pro Brexit talks rather than about the arguments to remain was a big problem as well. And the way that the chairman must be appointed needs to be disconnected from government. The reason it needs to be disconnected from government is because it's too much political sway. The other problem as well is that I know. And I'm saying this, I generally believe that, like, when we talk about what's happening in Gaza, for example, we know that they've been very keen not to really attack Israel too harshly. And that is because there are certain groups who have influence on the BBC as well. These are problems that need to be resolved. The BBC needs to become impartial. That is, for me, one of the bigger things, that it needs to do in order to survive the future. Especially as we're having an ever-changing, growing environment where more and more people are being put off by mainstream media because they're not being clear and honest about what's happening in the real world. And there are many media outlets and certain news websites and whatnot who aren't being very clear and honest about what's actually happening, or they put a headline in such a way, like even here, like this headline from Byline Times, like I think they're pretty okay to a certain extent. I know people will disagree, but like mutualised, like what kind of word do you put in that? Like for me, that just like screams what's that all about? Biased, obviously, make the word make sense, but mutualised, never heard. Like this is the first time I've heard of that word, me personally. But there is this issue that with regards to journalism or media as a whole, is there's not enough regulation on it. There needs to be more regulation on our freedom of press, because they're allowed to carte blanche and make up false stories, and simply by putting quotas or whatever to kind of cover themselves from actually facing any kind of action, which is really infuriating. So let's read into this, you guys. So the BBC must be mutualised in order to end its pro-establishment bias, a new report has found. So the Culture Secretary Lisa Andy is currently exploring mutualising the BBC in order to make it democratically accountable to the public. Under the plan, the corporation will become effectively owned and held accountable by its licence fee payers. A new report, which is published by the think tank Commonwealth and the Media Reform Coalition, calls for the BBC to be mutualised from 2027, where the government is required to renew its corporation royal charter in order to end what it describes as a pro-establishment bias, arguing that the BBC's news reporting is driven by the statements and actions of legal politicians, state officials, and sources from business and finance. As a result, the BBC presents a narrow range of and exhibits a lack of balance on important political issues, the report states. The report states that the BBC's reporting has reflected the interest of the UK state, rather than assuming an impartial position on issues like Israel's genocide in Gaza, as well as its general orientation of political coverage towards Westminster, rather than the effects of the decision on the country as a whole. The report suggests that the bias stems partly from the BBC's funding model, leaving it unwilling to challenge the government, on which it ultimately relies on financial security. They argue in its current form the BBC has been able and unwilling to address the often contradictory claims of its critics to be able to assert their relatively merits. The organisation that emerges under the new charter must be able to do so, and in a manner that secures the respect of those who fund it. The authors of the report argue that mutualisation is a necessary remedy for a BBC struggling with accusations of bias, declining public trust and competition in an international market of streaming service. The report also proposes that civilians become members of mutually owned BBC with democratic input on how the BBC operates. This, the authors argue, would operate through members' panels, which would be anything bodies made up of members of the public who would like to counsel parts of the BBC and what the public wants from their broadcaster. Under Commonwealth's proposal, every BBC member would have the right to allocate a share of the BBC budget to support independent public interest content. While the report does not endorse any particular funding model for the BBC, the authors argue that a mutual BBC must inherit to its founding principles of universally, so that it responds to the concerns of all those who fund it, including by taking into account individuals' ability to pay as well as independent, so that the BBC is not responded to political interference and is instead accountable to the public. Thomas Chivers, one of the authors of the report, told Byline Times, with right-wing politicians and big tech billionaires threatening to tear up our national institutions, we need generally democratic media that is owned and controlled and accountable to the public. Mutualising the BBC will restore the BBC's place as a vital public service, securing its independence from government interference and making us all active and direct participants in a shared conversation about what kind of society we want to live in. Lisa Nandy, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, is reportedly considering mutualisation of the BBC as an option in the upcoming review of the broadcaster's royal charter. Now, while running for the Labour leader in 2020, Nancy wrote, instead of a tokenetic consultation with the people who pay for it and backroom negotiation with the government, the BBC should move to a model of being owned and financed and directed by licence fee holders. Who can help decide the trade-offs that the BBC must make to secure its future. This will mean a new structure for the BBC board that focuses on genuine public representation and participation and greater commitments to transparency. Natty reiterated her proposal in 2024, telling the Financial Times that mutualisation is something that various Conservative and Labour politicians have proposed over the years, and I think it's worth exploring. The Department of Media, Culture, Media and Sport told Byline Times the Culture Secretary has become clear in the upcoming Charter review will consider a wider range of issues, including the BBC continues to thrive and operate sustainability. They added that we will provide more details about the Charter plans in due course. Nancy may not get this chance to have her say in the Charter review process. However, the Sunday Times report that Starmer is considering abolishing the DCMS and Nancy's role along with it as part of the government's reaction to heavy losses in May's local elections. Chavez has added that the BBC faces existential threats and is failing in many of its duties as an impartial, independent broadcaster that serves all UK audiences equally. The forthcoming Charter review may be the last chance we have to radically transform the BBC into the kind of democratic institution. Even if the current government is friendlier towards the BBC than the last government, the BBC will not survive if Labour chooses to merely tinker around the edges during the upcoming Charter review. Unless the BBC is radically reformed and the public are given real democratic powers to shape it, then our national public broadcaster faces a bleak future of dwindling audiences, collapsing funding and inevitable irrelevance. This would deprive British audiences in one of its few national institutions with a duty to serve their needs and interests and leave us with a media landscape dominated entirely by Murdochs, Musks and Rothermeres. And that is true. I do generally believe that we need... I mean this. I really do think we need the BBC. I really think it's really, really important that the BBC is protected as much as it possibly can be. it is still loved, it is still used, even by younger audiences, even though people are turning more to social media now. Yes, that is slowly happening as well. But I do think the BBC still has its role to play in society, it has a role to play not just as a state broadcaster, but also for the programmes that it does as well. I think all of that is really, really important. And yes, the fundamental changes do need to be made to it. And I do agree that having more people, having more of the public say on the BBC rather than governments and businesses, which is exactly what was put in there, I think that would make an absolute massive difference. I really do. But how we get to the kind of BBC that everyone will be pleased with, I don't know. But here's the other thing as well. It's really important to stress. No matter what we do to the BBC, you can't please everyone. There's always going to be someone somewhere who's going to kick up a fuss. And that is the reality. But what do you guys think? What do you guys make of that the BBC should be mutualised to end its pro-establishment bias? Do you agree with the report on this? Do you agree? What do you think about Ollie Hayes' report? Let me know your thoughts and more down in the comment section below. If you found this video informative or interesting, hit that like button, share it across social media, subscribe if you haven't to already. Check out Rumble and Patreon content as well. And if you want to financially support me and the work that I do here on this channel, you can do so by clicking the join button down below to become a YouTube member for as little as 99p. So thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to catch you all very, very soon.